Thank you.
And as you both well know, 3 days later, Sandra Bland was placed under arrest. She was put into a jail cell. 3 days later, she was found hanging in her cell. Some of the department are alleging suicide, but her death is being investigated as a murder right now. But let's go back to that initial exchange, Tom, when the police officer asked her to put out her cigarette and she refused because in her mind it wasn't illegal to smoke in her car. What do you make of that?
Well, as was reported earlier, this was not your textbook traffic stop. She was also not the textbook motorist either. So, there's enough blame to go around here in this initial part of this exchange. Ironically, I just went to a training for a company called Blue Courage, bluecourage.com. They actually do trainings now with police officers across the United States, and a lot of their training revolves around something exactly like this, where the need to escalate this didn't necessarily need to happen. As we've discussed in a lot of other incidents like this, though, if someone, is pulled over for a violation, they are already at a disadvantage. They've already violated the law in some way. So now the officer, we would hope that they would act professionally. That's what they're trained to do, and that's our expectation when we are pulled over by the police. In a case where you have an officer who's agitated for one reason or another, whether it be her fault or otherwise, once she's acknowledged that he's agitated, she further agitates him by not complying with him, and that's where this whole thing goes downhill. And that's why I try to advocate to people that, regardless of why you believe you should have been pulled over or not pulled over, once the officer has pulled you over and now is giving you lawful orders, you really should comply with them, ideally.
And you have to legally, I believe, according to Paul Callan, Mark Lamont Hill, he says you should obey everything a police officer asks you to do, but this really got out of control. It got out of control to the point, as I said, he threatens to tase her. She gets out of the car. He puts her in handcuffs. She's on the ground. He has her knee in her back. And then he takes her to jail, and something terrible happens.
Yeah.
I just want to get your general impressions of this whole incident, Mark.
Well, I think the most tragic thing about all of this was that it was entirely avoidable and preventable. When he pulls her over, he walks up to the woman and says, what's wrong? You seem to have an attitude. Many people have an attitude when they're pulled over. Many people are frustrated when they get pulled over by the police, whether they did it or whether they didn't do it. No one wants to get pulled over by police. But he was essentially egging her on. He was asking her questions that prompted her to give the responses that she gave. To me, she was following instructions. Just because she asked why she was pulled over, and to my knowledge, she asked about 14 times by my count why she was pulled over, he never responded. Again, this was preventable. He could have told her why she was being pulled over. She said that she didn't want to put the cigarette out because it was in her car. It was at the moment where she said she didn't want to put the cigarette out that he tells her to get out of the car. That suggests that it was her refusal to put out a cigarette that got her taken out of the car. Now, again, she has a right to smoke in her car. Do you have a responsibility legally to do what police officers say? Yes, within reason and within the boundaries of the law. The police can't just tell you to do anything. But in this case, she was asserting her rights. She was asserting her dignity. Did she have a chip on her shoulder, an attitude, as some commentators have said? Perhaps, but many of us just call that dignity.
Let's talk about that chip on her shoulder, because we're trying to figure out whether she committed suicide later in that jail cell or something more nefarious happened. This is what Sandra Bland posted on her Facebook page a short time ago. I want you to watch it.
White people. Yes. Black people know that all lives matter. But what I need you guys to understand is that being a black person in America is very, very hard. Although you all love to say, oh, nobody should see race, people are the reason that racism is still alive. Well, what kind of people are the reason? Black racists have no power, whereas white racists do. They have power because they are in positions of control, or they're in positions where they can influence the control over black people. Yes, that is very true.
So Ms. Blunt already had that in her head, Tom, and here's this police officer, and you can sort of understand why this thing escalated the way it did, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, again, I couldn't begin to imagine how it is to be a person of color. I'm not a person of color. I am, however, a former detective with 22 years in the NYPD and white, and most of my interactions were with people of color for 22 years, and I was able to do that professionally and do it safely no one died in my custody. I didn't have to take anyone's life or take that level of force in action. But, so I understand how people, there's perceptions about the police and what police do. There's realities about what police do. And somewhere in the middle there is the reality.
But I would say, Mark, that investigators are taking that video into account when they investigate whether Ms. Bland possibly committed suicide in that jail cell. Your thoughts?
I don't see the connection. I mean, if every black person who had a critique of white supremacy and state power killed themselves, there wouldn't be any black people left. What you saw in that video is an articulation of a certain understanding of American politics and American racial life that many black people share. She didn't show up to that car stop with any extravagant chip on her shoulder. She showed up there as a black woman in America who understands how law